Okay, so welcome everyone to our ACMS Virtual Speaker Series event today. Our topic, of course, is 20th century Mongolia. So just a little bit about the ACMS first. The ACMS is an organization. You can find out more at mongoliacenter.org, dedicated to supporting scholars of Mongolian studies. Okay, so going to jump right into it. We're going to have presentations by each panelist for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we will be having question and answer. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll be collecting them, and then I will be able to present them to the speakers after they give their presentations. So first of all, we are going to hear from Dr. Morris Rosseby, who's speaking about science and socialist Mongolia.
Okay, thank you very much, Marissa. I want to thank Dr. Yuki Konagaya and Dr. Lagvasaran, who are the basis of this presentation. They've been involved. Yuki is a curator at the Minpaku, the Museum of Ethnology in Osaka, Japan. She and Dr. Lagvasaran have been interviewing a wide variety of Mongolians who were played a role in Mongolia in the 20th century, and a wide variety of occupations: statesmen, agronomists, even a wrestler, and it provided us with a kind of a basic social history of Mongolia, which has had an impact on the politics also of Mongolia. What I'd like to talk about today is a series of 6 scientists who were interviewed by Yuki and Lagvasaran, and their interpretations of what happened in science, mostly during the period from the 1920s to 1990. By the time 1990 taking place, most of them were retired and had the time to be interviewed by Dr. Konagaya. They all derived, all of them, all 6 of them derived from herding households, and would probably have remained in herding households for much of their career, much of their lives. One had a connection with a Buddhist monk, and that brought him into a different sphere and allowed him to further his education. Nearly all attended these very simple dormitory schools, mostly in Gers. They didn't have substantial buildings and didn't have many supplies, according to several of the interviewees. What propelled them forward was doing fairly well and not wishing to go back to their families. They talk about many of the children not wanting to stay in the dormitory schools, wanting to return to their families, wetting their beds in order to be sent back to their households. But these kids, these 6 youngsters, did well, and the next step on their road to being scientists was going to the capital city, a city which they found absolutely dazzling. They first encountered radios in Ulaanbaatar, electric lighting, permanent buildings, and this made a terrific impression on them, according to the interviews. And they then had much better conditions in their secondary schools, more facilities than in the countryside dormitories. But even so, they realized that in order to make that quantum leap forward, not only the physicists, but all of them making the quantum leap forward, was to go to the Soviet Union, where there were better facilities and more advanced training that they required for their professions. 4 of the 6 studied at Moscow University. And only the historian, I was pleased that Yuki placed the historian as a scientist, being a historian myself, and he had his training in the National University of Mongolia that had a much better training than in for Mongolian history than Russia necessarily. The other one was a physician who wanted to actually work in the Mongolian countryside. He was not interested in staying in the city, and so he needed training in the most common ailments and diseases at that time, not super sophisticated medicine, and so he stayed in Mongolia. The four who went on to the Soviet Union, they couldn't have praised the Soviet Union more than you could imagine. I mean, I was startled by their view of the Soviet scientists, of the reception that they were accorded in the Soviet Union. And they immediately, as soon as they got there, they collaborated with Russian scientists on space exploration, on biology, and they were very grateful for the training that they received in the Soviet Union. They were not keen on the idea that the Soviet Union portrayed itself as the big brother necessarily, and the Mongolian as the little brothers, but by and large, they had a very positive attitude towards their training in the Soviet Union. Beyond the Soviet Union, many of them credited the Literary Committee with fostering scientific and other kinds of research. A literary committee that was started in the 30s, and then in 1961 reorganized into the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, whose principal responsibility, obviously, was research. They had spectacular experiences, as I say, in the Soviet Union, and then came back to Mongolia to top flight positions in the scientific community. Despite their general admiration for the Soviet Union, the interviewees unanimously were appalled by the disastrous purges of the 30s. And those who had relatives who were lamas or monks were particularly distressed at what they perceived to be the persecution of what was the persecution of Buddhism. Long discussions of how awful the 30s were, the late 30s were for Buddhism, despite the fact that nearly all of them were atheists. They professed themselves to be atheists. They were very upset with what had happened in the monasteries, and even though they themselves were not Buddhists, they helped in a number of cases save Buddhist artifacts and scriptures in the countryside from being destroyed. The historian lamented the execution of a whole group of historians also in the late 30s, and also mentioned, several of them mentioned the important geographer and naturalist who came from Russia, Andrei Simikov, who did a tremendous amount in the late 20s and 30s in archaeology, geography, producing one of the earliest maps of the country, a variety of different pursuits in Mongolia. And of course, he was eventually wound up in the Gulag, where he died in 1942. So the purges did affect each one of them rather dramatically, and they had very personal experiences with the purges. They themselves, a couple of them were actually wound up in prison for a couple of years, but they managed to survive during this terrible period. They, on the other hand, they don't mention anything like the Lysenko scandal in the Soviet Union, when there was a kind of purge of scientists, deliberate purge of scientists who did not agree with the theories of Lysenko in the Soviet Union. They didn't find a particular theory that dominated science in Mongolia, and that led to the kind of purges that occurred in the Soviet Union. The two who remained in Mongolia, a historian, was flabbergasted. He was one of the few Mongolians with an excellent knowledge of Chinese. He studied Chinese quite well, but he was assigned to teach at the Central Committee of the Mongolian People's Republic, of Mongolian People's Party. And instead of having his excellent skills in Chinese being made use of in Mongolia in the 30s and early 40s. It took a tremendous amount of effort finally to reach a stage where he could be a professor of history. He was sort of a party, teaching the party at various times. So they had their complaints about the political structure of science in the 30s and 40s, the tremendous impact of non-academic aspects to training and to their work. They also pointed out that any sort of challenge to politics sometimes would lead to being ostracized by the institutions in which they were found. One thing I found quite fascinating was the fragility of life during this time, even well into the socialist period. One of them had two younger brothers who died very young age. Another had two sisters who died very young, before the age of 4. The infant mortality rate staggering even through the 1940s. I hadn't been aware of that kind of danger to young people, even 25 years or so after the success of the socialist revolution. One describes picking up a young boy who had died and carrying the body of this deceased child to its grave. It's staggering. It gives you a vivid picture of some of the social conditions that still existed even after the Second World War. The doctor repeatedly mentions the process. He says when he first arrived, he found no medical books in the location where he was sent. Hard to permit him to cover the vast distances for which he was responsible, and medicines and vitamins and so on were in short supply through the late 40s and early 50s. That's quite a challenge to some of the more optimistic views about medicine in Mongolia during even this early socialist period. In terms of the 1990 events since 1990, they expressed some satisfaction with changes since 1990, but were quite critical of developments since 1990. Several were distressed by the cutbacks in funding for education. A number of them mentioned the poor quality of private universities, where principal motivation was profit, leading to not a particularly distinguished instructional staff, limited library facilities, and directors cutting corners to ensure profit. Others lamented the decline of vocational education in the country and the shortage of mechanics, carpenters, other specialists. And all of them criticized the government for its lack of concern for herding, or what they perceived to be a lack of concern for herding, the kind of mainstay of traditional Mongol society. So they were not particularly ecstatic about the changes that had occurred since 1990. They appreciated the greater freedom, individual freedom to pursue their own vocation, vocational plans, but lots of things bothered them a great deal. I want to say a couple of words about one of the figures that Yuki is particularly dealing with, a non-Mongolian, Andrei Simakov, a man who played a very important role in the development of sciences in Mongolia in the 20s and 30s. He was voluminous in his interests, interested in geography, interested in botany, interested in environmental concerns, interested in herding, attempts to create a better herding environment, and had been fascinated by Mongolia from his early days. And we have, Yuki was able to get a tremendous treasure trove of documents, diaries that he produced from the period of the Russian Revolution. He left Mongolia in the 1920s, so he was in Soviet Union or Russia and then the Soviet Union for a critical period. And we're hoping that those documents will be translated and made available, not only information about Mongolia, but about the Soviet period, the early period of the Russian. Was always interested in the natural world, and he came from a relatively prosperous background in Russia, but of course that put him in a difficult situation when the Russian Revolution occurred. He was eligible, he was very bright, he was eligible for university education, but was denied entrance because he was descended from the bourgeoisie. So he was taken on in the high military armored car school in the Soviet Union around 1921, which actually worked in his favor. He learned about how to maintain cars, and so when an archaeological expedition led by Mr. Kozlov, a prominent archaeologist, Soviet archaeologist who worked in Mongolia, he was able to go on the expedition. And that set him up. From that point on, he remained in Mongolia till he was imprisoned in the late 1930s. He worked brilliantly with Mongolian scientists and learned Mongolian, both classical writing and modern, as it began to be developed, modern Mongolian, and was instrumental in setting up a museum, was instrumental in going out to monitor events in various places in the country, to write up developments in various parts of the herding economy, try to improve the herding of animals, producing maps of mountain ranges, doing all sorts of phenomenal work in Mongolia, producing a work on flora and fauna in various parts of Mongolia. We don't know why the heck he was imprisoned. why was he sent to Siberia in 39? There is, you look at his letters, you look at his diaries, and you wonder what prompted this. It's, we haven't come up with any sort of solution as to why he was taken to Siberia. He didn't have any political views, and it's just one of those things that happened to scientists and others and other people as well in this dreadful period of the late 1930s. Turns out, of course, that there are his descendants who played a role in modern Mongolian history. His granddaughter was Minister of Foreign Relations in the period after 1990, Minister of the Environment. One of his grandsons played a very important role in Mongolian democracy from 1990 on. And he is a truly remarkable writer about nature. We hope that at some point some of his work will be available in English. Yuki Konagai has just put out a lot of his work in Russian, and many specialists in the Western world don't know Russian, and so it'll be great if his work is translated. Okay, let me stop and turn it over to Simon, or turn it over to Marissa to introduce Simon, whichever you prefer.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I just make a note that I believe that Minpaku publication is at the ACMS library, the Simokov collection, and a lot of this wonderful social histories can be found also on the Minpaku website. So I also agree they're fascinating. So yeah, Simon, I will just let you go ahead.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that little set of vignettes about Simukov, because this is a nice segue into literature. Simukov is one of the candidates for the paternity of the well-known Mongolian writer Zedendorj, and the other one being a German biologist, apparently. But that's a nice segue, maybe. So I'm going to share my desktop. If I can. Okay. Right. Okay. So my presentation, as you can see, is about the Soviet hero in post-war literature, but not the whole thing. Not the whole post-war literature. This is really going to cover a very short period between the Second World War and the death of Choibalsan and Stalin in the very early 50s. So if I can, now I'm trying to move it forward. Hang on. Okay. All right. Okay, good. Okay, so by the start of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union had helped Mongolia to develop in many ways. So firstly, it had given the revolution, or it had advanced the revolution. And also, as Morris was saying, it had also brought healthcare, education, veterinary science, industrialization, but maybe not, like he was also saying, maybe not to a really great extent. But the discourse was that the Soviets had brought a really fantastic array of scientific, Western scientific strengths, and this was really beneficial for Mongolian people and Mongolian society. So, and reciprocally, Mongolia during the war had given its entire economic and military focus to support the Soviet Union against the National Socialists. And so really the situation that pertained is that Mongolia had a kind of felt a kind of a debt to the Soviet Union, but also there was this feeling of the Soviet Union as being the heroic, like Morris also said, the heroic elder brother. And much of the creative work that was done in the post-war period, and maybe primarily in the first 10 or so years, maybe until about the late 50s or maybe 1960 or so, was really to promote the Soviet Union as the home of the heroic. And Mongolians were encouraged to be heroic in that manner. And we see writers like Senge during the war period writing about the Stakhanovites and the Odaniki, and encouraging Mongolians to turn to labor and to almost fetishize labor. And this happened during the war, but after the war, these more domestic issues like healthcare and education and science became more important. And so the three books that I would like to look at, let's actually go back to this. This is from the 1948, the first Writers' Conference in 1948. And Dugasuren, who gives the keynote address, talks about how many of the writers are trying very hard to develop these ideas. But he says the poems and songs they have written about labor, or about Sukhbaatar and Choibalsan, or about the friendship between the Soviet Union and Mongolia, or the new man, Novy Zhiny in Russian, the ideal man, are rare. Okay, and so the idea of Dugasuren is that writers should be really looking at these issues and also continuing to try and write about youth and physical exercise, or industry and herding, and all these more domestic ideas. And his idea was to bring the writers should bring Soviet heroes and make Mongolian heroes in the model of Soviet heroes. And so I want to look today at three texts by two writers. One, the Kazakh Mongolian writer Bizia, and the other one, Lodoidam. And here is the timeline of these texts. So the end of the Great Patriotic War in 1945, and Bizia's text Belek, the Gifts, which Dugasuren explicitly mentions in his address, is in 1947. And then Choibalsan dies in 1952, and also in 1952 Lodoidam publishes his novel Alted in the Altai. And then in 1953, the death of Stalin. In 1953, he publishes Manais Sugulinhan, our schoolmates, our school friends. And in 1954, Lodoidam is awarded the State Prize for the combined success of Alted and Manais Sugulinhan. And so this consolidates Lodoidam as one of the leading writers of his generation. So you'll see that by that time he was mid-30s. Bizia was not such an important writer, but Belek is a really important text following the Second World War, showing how the Soviet influence on the revolution was still really impactful even after the war. So these texts, the first impression. So who is the hero? So who are the heroes of these texts? So in Bizier's text, in Belek, it's the Russian Ivan, and this story takes place 30 years before it was written, so in 1917. And Ivan is a Russian with whom the narrator is transporting sheepskins on camel, in a camel caravan to Beska in Sakhala in Russia. And so the narrator says, my friend was no ordinary man. He had traveled around Mongolia for 5 years and spoke our tongue better than I did. Thinking about Lenin and my friend was one of Merciful Lenin's brave heroes. So the idea of Ivan is he understood Mongolia. This is why he was a hero. He understood Mongolia, and he was a connection with Lenin, because as we will see, this narration, this story is all about the revolutionary zeal just before the revolution, the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, the revolutionary zeal for the Soviet, for Russia, for the Russian people, and also for Mongolian people. In Lododam's Alted, the hero is Professor Panov, Nikolai Vladimirovich Panov, who is described as a Soviet research scientist, a doctor of geological science. So he brings academic credibility. He brings scientific credibility. Again, not only did he speak Mongolian fluently, but he had worked with Mongolians for a long time and understood the Mongolian character well. So again, the hero is not just what he can do outside Mongolia, but the hero is also a hero because he understands Mongolia. He appreciates Mongolian culture. He appreciates Mongolian people. He appreciates the Mongolian language. And this is really important. He's not just someone parachuted in from Russia. He really appreciates Mongolia. And in Mane Sogulinhan, the doctor. So the whole, the story of this is that this is about a group of school children who are at school, and one of them gets very sick. It's kind of timely right now to be talking about this. And there's this kind of infection that runs around the school. And this one girl infects everyone else. And she remains the one person who is really sick. And the story is really about how the doctor, a Russian doctor, a Soviet doctor, comes, or a Soviet woman doctor comes and makes friends with the students and is very kind and thoughtful and compassionate, but also a really good doctor, and who eventually cures this little girl. So we see here a slightly different first impression. The doctor is not named, she's only the doctor, Emekte, or just Emch. So it says, aren't you going to greet the doctor? Asked our teacher, Dalkanyambo. No one said a word. The doctor came and stroked my head, and I jumped in surprise. The doctor recognized my surprise, and she looked at me with a smile. So why was the narrator surprised? Well, maybe because he had not seen a Western, or a white Western person before. But the doctor immediately calms the narrator and the little girl who's really sick, and all her school friends too. And she calms them with her demeanor. She's not a hero, maybe like Ivan, or not a scientific genius like Panov, but she's just a good, kind, thoughtful person. So how is the hero heroic? Ivan, I mean, I'm not going to read all this because it's a lot of text, but from looking at this, you can see how Ivan is describing the importance of revolution. So he tells the narrator Ivgel of the importance of the revolution, and he tells him at the end, we'll also help the Mongolian, we'll be victorious, we'll also help the Mongolian people who are like our brothers and sisters. We should all support our struggle. Okay, and he convinces Ivgel, who is sort of uncertain about the importance of revolution and concerned, as many people were at the time, about the uncertainty of bringing the Soviets in. He tries to convince Ivgel that everything is going to be okay, and so this mindset, this heroic revolutionary mindset, even in 1947, I think, you know, this is a really important character for this tough Russian hero. So this is how Ivan is heroic, the revolutionary fighter, how he is heroic. And Panov is heroic because he fought in the war. So Ivan is going to fight in the October Revolution. Panov actually fought in the war and took part in the siege of Stalingrad. And he has this whole narrative. There are many times during the text, during Alted, where he talks about his experiences. But as you can see, if you read this central quotation here, it's kind of fantastic. It's kind of exaggerated, but you get the feeling that part of Panov's heroism is that he can tell a really good story, and he can enthuse his readers or his listeners, his audience. So, you know, he has this story about being attacked by this German and obviously riding without his hands on the reins. And the upshot of this is that Panov manages to catch, get the German to a point where he gives up, and Panov is able to overwhelm the German and capture him. Okay, so, and not only does he add this Soviet scientific thinking, this intellectual ability, but he's also obviously a very tough and resolute fighter. And finally, he saves one of his fellow scientists, Bayer, who goes out and falls unconscious in the hills, in the mountains of the Altai. So he has a past of heroism. He has a present of great intellectual, scientific advances, and he also is tough and resolute and able in terms of the present day too. So if you go out with Panov, you can be sure that you will be safe and well looked after, and you'll also get a good story. So, you know, there is now, we have the feeling of the hero as slightly more accessible and more fun to be with, but also very strong and very, very intellectually gifted and very heroic in a kind of very classical sense. And as for the doctor, so the doctor not only cures Dulma, or the little girl who's so sick, but also she is a Russian, and she is teaching about Lenin and Stalin. So she teaches the kids about Lenin and Stalin and about what she understands and about this kind of family idea that was very popular, of Lenin and Stalin being paternal figures. And also this was, remember, the cult of personality time. So Lenin and Stalin have a kind of superannuated presence in much of the literature at this time. And this is one of the more famous works of this period. And the Doctor's real heroism is to be able to teach not only how to act, teach how Russian science, how Russian medical science can cure Mongolians, but also to have a kind of ideological teaching. Right, so all the kids now understand from this dialogue that they too are the child of Lenin and Stalin. And so the final part of the heroism, so how can we be heroic? How can the reader be heroic? We can follow Ivan's model. He's focused on the revolution, and he reflects a commitment to the liberation of the people. Now, although in 1947 this had already been established through the revolution, it was an ongoing revolution. And you find in Dugasuren's address to the Writers' Conference in 1948, he's also saying, you know, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to carry on expressing the people's liberation and making sure that everybody is kept kept in this family of the liberation of the Mongolian people, and also remaining committed to the relationship with the Soviet Union, which will intensify the liberation of the people. So you could also follow Panov's model, scientific and brave, reflecting a commitment to physical ability, which also connects with the importance of healthcare, and scientific progress. The scientific progress, there are a lot of passages in Alted about the science that these geologists do. And this is obviously reflecting the importance of that time, at that time, of the scientific development and the scientific the scientific influence of the Soviet the influence of Soviet scientists. That's what I'm trying to say on Mongolian science. And thirdly, you can have the Doctor's model, scientific and kind. And this is reflecting commitment to education and to healing and to healthcare, which, as Morris was saying, although there was this idea that the Soviet healthcare was really great, it may not have been so effective at this particular moment in the early 50s. And so the final exhortation of the Doctor seems to really talk to the idea of heroism and patriotism and the encouragement of the relationship between the Soviet Union and Mongolia, but also of the encouragement of the Mongolian people to become real leaders. So he says, among you there will be scholars, teachers, engineers, doctors, and writers, right? And you will help advance your country, right? So move forward resolutely. A path is open for your study and enterprise. I wish you all the best. I will never forget you. And so again, you see this hero as the person who exhorts the Mongolians into action, but also someone with a deep and profound feeling for the Mongolian people. So that's the end of this presentation. So so to sum up, maybe if I can come out, yeah. So to sum up, the idea of heroism in these texts was really solidifying the idea of the Soviet Union as the friend and ally and brother of the Mongolian people, but also to encourage the Mongolians to develop in their own way and to find their own way through science and education and healthcare. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, Simon. All right. Maduhai.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for organizing the workshop and inviting me. So I guess I should do this. Sorry, I am going to share my slides. And I do this every day, but now because I've been up since 6 o'clock, I'm a little bit spaced out. Can you see my screen? Is this good? Yeah. All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be presenting on the topic, Why Revolution Did Not End, International Relations and the Mongolian Women. And this talk is mainly about how the leadership of the Mongolian Women's Committee, the women's organization in Mongolia, have facilitated the development of Mongolian women as public and by extension political subjects, right? As active participants in the society, as people who are not only active at home, but also in the society and who view themselves primarily as relatively equal to men and being able to carry out various kinds of activities, including leadership posts. So the topic is interesting in a sense that it sort of emerged from my current work on Mongolian women politicians, current women politicians during democratic period, because every time I presented about Mongolian women in the 2000s and how they were participating in politics, I kept getting a lot of questions about how democracy was transforming women and making them into active political persons. And then I realized that much of the world, and maybe even some of the Mongolians do not realize that women have been actually probably even maybe more active during socialism than, at least just as active as now. And there was never this period where women were kind of actively relegated to the so-called domestic sphere, a domestic sphere being more or less a construct by certain societies, so to speak, by the scholarship that emerged on the basis of certain society. So the importance of studying what was the position of Mongolian women during socialism is twofold. Is to highlight the Mongolian women, the role of Mongolian Women's Committee from 1924 to 1990, and this will be sketchy because it's such a big topic, in two kinds of ways, highlight two contributions. One is that the committee and its more than 5,000 branches contributed in two kinds of ways. One, what I call effective, and second, pragmatic. Effective contribution is making women as agents in public and political sphere, not letting them to become docile bodies, not to sort of retreat to the so-called domestic sphere, and really shape the so-called newly emerging public and political sphere and make sure that women were active there. They did it in consistent way, and they fought for it. And I will explain why I say they fought for it, because the position of women usually in official literature is usually explained as relegated by the party. And my point is that the Women's Committee and the party actually had good relationships, but also at times contentious relationships. The space that women were able to gain needed to be fought for. And behind the curtains fights and various kinds of ways in which the women leaders were able to forward their agenda was not as smooth as it looked from outside. The second contribution is what I think of as pragmatic. It's the contribution of Women's Committee to making the nation and making the women. And these are the sort of more I guess, beyond the person, more of legal programs and laws and contribution to the labor and creating various kinds of traditions and celebrations and dates and things like that. So even though we take for granted very much how we celebrate the Women's Rights Days and Children's or Mother's Days and things like that, all of these celebrations needed to be discussed and organized and validated why they were needed. So as I explained, so going back to why it's important is that to show that Mongolian women became politically active on to dispel two kinds of assumptions, that women became politically active only with the advent of democratization and the introduction of liberal feminism. Liberal feminism likes to take credit for Mongolian women being active, running for parliament and being independent and proactive, etc., etc. So this is a response to that. And second, women's organizations during socialism, second assumption that, and this assumption is not only about Mongolian women, but also women of socialist countries, former socialist countries in Eastern and Central Europe as well, that women's organizations during socialism were only the handmaidens of the state and did not produce any tangible outcomes for women. This assumption is based on the fact on liberal feminism being as seeing itself as always being outside of the state, outside of the official structure. It's a feminism that doesn't accept the constraints of power, especially of political power. So if the women are in political parties or in some kind of organizations that are not, then they're not true feminists. And by that definition, Mongolian women during socialism were not feminists in liberal feminist sense. They were within the state. They did not have sort of separated area where they needed to discuss only women's issues. Women did not see themselves that way. The women actually saw themselves as part of the state and as active agents who needed to contribute to all spheres of life, not just the so-called women's issues. There was the women's and children's issues were not necessarily just the issues for women, right? So women were interested in taking part in peace building and military and engineering and industry and things like that. So they were not isolated and relegated into separate sphere. Methods and sources. So if you go to read the official history books from the that was published during socialism, the language is really interesting. It doesn't have it doesn't give agency to the people. It's as if things just happens on its own. I mean, if you go and try to look for active heroes, I think heroes exist in literature, Simon, and then in history books, it's more like the hero is the party. So, and the people kind of follow it. So there is this interesting vacuum about agents. Right. So my goal has been to discern this obscure language of the party state and read the history against the grain, and find where the women were. And so I really kind of did this interesting match sort of work, but reading the history books and then reading memoirs and letters and interviews and shreds of narratives here and there, and looking at the archival documents and newspapers and the women's magazines, trying to kind of piece together what was going on in the 1930s and 1940s that explains certain kinds of events that happened that affected the decisions that women leaders in Mongolian Women's Committee carried out and things like that. So it was really the work of weaving together what was going on in political part as well as in other aspects. So just to quickly, what I'm talking is the only organization for Mongolian women during socialism. It had many different names, and each time the name for the committee was changed, obviously its structure was changed, and its outreach, its power was changed. So I'm very interested in how that played out. So I will, how much time do I have? 10 more minutes? No?
Yeah.
So this is a picture of Yanjma, and so I actually wanted to start the picture with the presentation by Yanjma, who is the second chairwoman of the Mongolian Women's Committee. And in Mongolian Women's Committee was established in 1924, actually before the Mongolian Constitution was declared, and it was it was established originally as the arm of the state, and as the main task was political upbringing of women, and the first actually chairwoman was Damdni Pagum Dolum, who was ousted, or who actually not ousted by then, but she went to the school and then she couldn't return because of the repressions and things like that. She was the wife of Natsak Dorj. But about the oppressions and repressions later, what I want to say about Yanjma is back in 1925, during the second year of the Mongolian Women's Committee, and when the Mongolian Women's Committee was still a section of the propaganda department, she stood up in front of the by then the Politburo, and basically said that the women's organization doesn't want to be a section of the propaganda department. It wants to be its own department, because it's not just an arm of the state, but it's much more than that. And Yanjma requested money to create more resources for women's education, requested all kinds of resources and personnel and things like that, and it was granted. She received money even to start the periodical, which lasted for quite a long time. I think it lasted until almost the end of socialism, known as Imhtechuding Mongolia Imhtechud Sitgul, but back in the 1920s, it had a different name. It was called Women's Thoughts. It was a really great periodical, and so it started back in 1925. Yanjma also requested a Soviet advisor, Vera Tarantaeva, who arrived that year in 1925 to advise Mongolian women, and etc., etc. So during the time when Yanjma and then some other women became the leaders, it was the period when a lot of women went to study, because very few women probably knew the ways in which how were educated at the level that was necessary. They probably took up on various kinds of multiple kinds of responsibilities. So the work that the women's organization, the women's department did, the department of was staggering. It was not only to protect women from sliding back into the so-called superstition and start believing, start, gaining, getting into start resisting the state because of religion, or joining opposition forces and things like that, which and the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party was keen in political sort of education of women in order to make sure that they don't necessarily become part of the opposition. So, and women's department, the leaders of women's department did more than that. They started teaching women literacy. They actually went on to talk about Western style feminism and argued that women should become active in gaining education and pursuing careers and things like that. And especially Pagum Dolum was exceptionally bold in arguing, what would be considered very liberal feminism, abolishing different kinds of forced marriages and things like that. So all these recruiting women to work and etc. So all of that actually took place. The work they did was what it sounds like was quite amazing, and women did succeed in their proposition, and that's why there was some money. And if they were not pushing the state hard on giving them what they needed and helping them to organize things, as Chris Kaplonsky and other scholars and Nordby in England that they write, is that the state was, as long as women didn't convert into counter-revolutionaries, they were not necessarily keen to help women that much, right? So they were not, the state wasn't actively building at that time kindergartens or opening canteens or pouring money to schools. It was the work of the women's organization that was constantly arguing for resources for support in order to do that. Now, and that's Yenjma. I got it from Wikipedia. The archival materials from Yenjma's pictures that I found were not really good. So then what happened? By 1932, political situation has changed and the department was demoted back to a section in propaganda department. And this also happened in Soviet Union. And there are many explanations because of the changes in the political climate, because feminism was by then was considered as a bourgeois activity and ideology. Women's emancipation was already on its way, so it was needed. That was the argument from the party. And so what does demoting mean? It doesn't only mean changing the title, it also means changing the structure as well as the money that these women were getting in order to carry out the works that they were doing. So what did women do? And in this case, we are talking about the earlier revolutionary women. They rerouted their organizations emphasis from political upbringing to building industrialization and transforming the country from nomadic pastoralist country into industrial. Because by 1930s, and especially after the massacre and political violence of the 1930s, and during the World War II, the country was struggling to do at least two things in this context. One is to deal with the fact that it has lost a lot of people and resources, lost a lot of men because of the purges, lost a lot of people and men because of the war, and still we're trying to build the industry and revive the factories. And there was a shortage of people, shortage of workers. So the Women's Committee jumped right in and reprogrammed themselves. Basically, they just rebooted themselves, saying that maybe the political upbringing of women is complete. Yes, the women do not need to be educated in political terms as much as before, but women can now contribute to the industrialization of the country, right? And they can help with the job placement in reviving the factories and bringing up the economy that has been struggling because of the war and because of the massacre of the political violence. So what these women did was reorganizing their political groupings into workshops, right? So always sort of aligning the work of the organization with the motives of the state and proposing and taking sort of taking into their hands the matters was their way of doing things. So as we know, during the World War II, women were heroic, and we know Front Sigmid, a woman who traveled to Novosibirsk area, who delivered the livestock as well as supplies to the Russian army. We know a lot of different stories about how women contributed to the situation. Now, so this is so it's almost second time the party was demoting, trying to kind of shrink the women's activities. The third time, was it third time? No, this is the first time, and this is the second time. The second time, right after the war, the World War II, the Politburo of the party eliminated all positions and branches of the women's department throughout the country. There were more than 5,000 branches. In every SOM, in every work unit, there was a branch of women's committee, even if it was just a person who was carrying that name, right? The representative from the Women's Committee. So it appears that with the women firmly in the workforce and with World War II over, the women's department was no longer needed for the party on the scale that it was during the time of national crisis and hardship. And sending women back home from their political and public positions to the so-called domestic sphere is known throughout the world, right? When the nation is in crisis, then women get mobilized. They given resources, they given titles, they are emancipated. As soon as the crisis is over and economic prosperity is on its way, women are asked to go and leave their jobs to men. So this is what has happened, and the women's organizations were seen now not as political organizations, but cultural and educational one, which means the funding is not going to be coming from the party, but it has to come from other local sources. So the next leader of the women's organization was a woman named Siligma, who got this organization that consisted basically of her and the desk. And so she decided to she wondered what she could do, how was she going to revive the organization. And one of the things she did was to and by this time, actually, after World War II, what is going on internationally? And so I forgot to say one more thing, is that regardless of the size of the organization, women's organization, and regardless of how active or less active they were, these women maintained their relationships with the Soviet Union as well as with other socialist countries. And after World War II, because of the of the emergence of Eastern European and other socialist countries, including some other not so socialist other countries, but socialist movements of women, transnational women's network has been very strong, and so Mongolia was part of it. And so back in the 1950s, during one of the celebrations of the International Women's Day on March 8th, Seligma she wrote a proposal to the Central Committee to declare March 8th a National Day of Celebration of Women. This is when things started. Her proposition was approved, so she sent letters to all the previous 5,000 organizations, to schools, to everywhere in the country, and most of them responded, and she was able to launch a huge celebration and celebrate women and to show the party the contributions that women made. And this is where we begin to see how this demonstration really making visible the contribution of women's labor, the contribution of women's creativity, really make women visible in Mongolia. So part of the problem was that the party, which was the leadership, which consisted mostly of men, was not aware of and wasn't thinking necessarily in those terms of what the role of women was. So as soon as Seligma used the March 8th to demonstrate the importance of women and women's contribution, and as soon as the party was able to, as soon as the women were able to convince the party about the importance, the party approved, again, the re-establishment of the women's organization. So then what happened next is that where am I? Then what happened is for a while, the women's organization was in place, and then in the 1960s, it was also, the party also started, saying that the sex equality is almost achieved. Women got a lot of welfare provisions. It has increased rights, and women have been promoted well. So that's another round of saying, why do we have to pay attention to women? Why do we need this organization? Why do we need so much money and spotlight and things like that? And so by this time in the 1960s, we now have Otvol, the writer, and many other women who are actually arguing for something really important and something interesting, which is we have enough rules because by the 1960s, even there is even a promotion, the 25% quota for leadership is even established, right? So, and what kept and other women are seeing that the legal decrees remained abstract, while the lives of ordinary women, herders especially, and working women have been poor. So they see the gap. They see the gap between the ideological and legal rhetoric and the real life, and they want to fill in and create opportunities for women to improve their lives within the constraints of the state. They can't go against the state. They can't go against pronatal policy, right? They can't say women need contraceptives and things like that. They found ways to improve women's conditions within that sphere. They can't, argue for increase of for changing the rules, but they can argue for improving women's situations. So and then one of the things that Otvol, I wanted to talk a little bit about Otvol, but I'm running out of time. Otvol did was she saw the need that in many organizations, despite the women and men were getting almost equal education, this is the situation that we have even today, right? There was lack of women in leadership, and so the decree was issued back in 1966 that women needed to be promoted in leadership positions, 21%, and then it was increased further. And this decree number 338 is really admirable. It's like a few pages long, and it has different sort of rules and plans of how it should be organized and who should be responsible for locating the women who can carry out the leadership, and who should be responsible for training these women, and who should be responsible for keeping an eye on finding these women, and who should be responsible writing up the plan of how they're going to move these educated women to different positions, and how they're going to oversee those transitions and things like that. So I'm going to stop here because I think I've been talking too much, and I just want to end this last I think this will be my last slide on Utbul and other women giving speeches. So my fascination with these women is the fact that they are able to carry out themselves so fluently in public and in the official sphere, as if this is something almost natural. And I think that this political upbringing and lobbying constantly for the rights of women, right? And advocating for women just, and not only just at the center of the Mongolian Women's Committee, but also at the center of AMEX and SOMS and schools, and from very early on, being on the stage and being able to speak, being able to be politically active is something that Mongolian women seem to not to worry too much about it. It's something that's learnable, and they learn quickly, and it's there, and it's not just the teaching of the women's capacity development workshops since 1990s. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mantokhaya. Dr. Smith had an earlier engagement, so she had to step out, but I think we can now carry on with our question and answer session. If anyone has questions, feel free to write it in the chat, or even just open your mic and ask it away. I do want to note one question we had on our Facebook Live page. Altın Alim asks from Dr. Rasabi about the links of the that you said were. So she says, could you please put those links, please? I may try to translate some into English. That the ones in Russian that Dr. Morris Rasabi was mentioning. So, Dr. Rasabi,
it's very hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Did you want? There was a question about getting in touch with Yuki Konagaya. Is that it?
Oh no,
there was
yeah,
some
that was a
question
question.
about
So
that in the chat.
another question was on our Facebook. Can you hear me better? Sorry, our signal is a little spotty here. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, so Altın Alim asked,
Oh, I see.
yeah, it's on our Facebook page. She asked the links in Russian that you mentioned could be translated by her.
Oh,
She
yeah.
volunteered to. Russian sources for Simukov, she said.
Oh, okay. Let me take them a little bit at a time. The question about diplomatic relations in the United States. There was a scientific group that came to Princeton in 1987, and I happened to be there. They were initiating contacts, and Dan Matuszewski, a prominent foundation person, brought them over to Princeton and then to New York. And then, of course, Biam Basuran came in the early 90s to meet with US officials. And he invited the Open Society Foundation to come to Mongolia to see if the Open Society could play a role in Mongolia. And I was contacted in 1994 by the Open Society to come to Mongolia to see if the Soros Foundation could play a role in Mongolia. We spent about 3 weeks interviewing people, a variety of different people, everything from President Ocherbak to people in NGOs, and made a report to Mr. Soros. And eventually, in 1996, 2 years later, after quite a bit of discussion, Mr. Soros agreed to set up a foundation in Mongolia, and Chris Finch became the head of the foundation for several years, and that's how the whole thing started. Biam Basuran met with you want to know who else he met with? I think he met with a number of people from Congress, and the congressional people varied in their views. They're delighted to have contact with Mongolia through an official Mongolian representative, and I think Mr. Soros was very pleased to have contact with Mongolia as well. I think that's what you wanted to know. We came in the spring of '94. That's right, and then the foundation lasted for, I believe, 6 or 7 years till 2003. A lot of foundations work spun off. The Mongolian Arts Council was originally part of the Soros Foundation, and a policy institute was spun off from the Soros Foundation and has played a role in Mongolia. I think that's what you wanted to know. As to getting in touch with Yuki Konagaya, if you send me an email, I have her email and I'll be glad to give it to you. I don't have it on me right now. Okay, I think that's the 2 questions I had.
Great. So we have that one comment, I guess, more from Altanelian, who said she could help translate the sources for Simukov. And then we have a question from Mulin He for Simon. How was Mongolianness represented in respect to the Soviets, who were taken to be the ones that brought much of Western innovations to Mongolia? Were Mongolians represented as a new herald of this modernization process in Asia, or were they portrayed in some other ways?
Hi, could you repeat that, Natsu?
Sure. How was Mongolianness represented in respect to the Soviets, who were taken to be the ones that brought much of Western innovations to Mongolia? That's the first part. And the second part is, were Mongolians represented as a new herald of this modernization process in Asia, or were they portrayed in some other ways?
I can probably only speak to this very small niche of Mongolian literature. But I would say that Mongolians write Mongolian literature at this time in a rather strange position. On the one hand, it seems to me that they are very much in awe of the developments that the Soviet Union is bringing to them. But equally, they are very strong and very independent and very keen to receive this in a Mongolian way. So I don't really see any of these writers kind of giving up their essential Mongolian culture and their Mongolian attitude. They don't. I don't think anybody tries to become Russian. It's really that they are the very much the individuals. But it's there was something that I said in my presentation, and now it's completely gone from my mind. So that's kind of useless. But I don't know whether that's really the kind of idea that this person was talking about, how they were represented to themselves. Is that what you understand, Natso, by this question?
I think that's what I try to ask, and I think that was a very good answer. And
Good.
Thank you so much, I guess.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Milind. Yeah, I think we can. If you guys want to ask your questions yourself, I'm happy to bring you here to the spotlight, so to speak. So next we have Dilgir Jarvaf and Maksuda. So Dilgir Jarvaf, you can unmute and ask.
Hi, thank you very much for very fascinating presentations. I just want to zoom out and kind of want to ask the speakers of their thoughts on how the specific aspects of life in Mongolia in the 20th century that you presented on compare to the experiences of other Soviet countries. So specifically in relations to the Women's Committee, right? So have the women's committees in other Soviet countries had similar effect on helping women develop their advocacy and organizational skills as in Mongolia? If not, what aspect of the Mongolian Women's Committee distinguishes it from similar organizations? So I ask that because I'm wondering what the experiences of Mongolian women tell us about the factors that contribute to women's activism in general. Thank you.
Hi, great question. So there is a book that I highly recommend titled Second Sex, Second World, or Second World, Second Sex it came out like a year ago or so by Kristen Gatsi. And it is about the transnational women's network specifically during socialism. So the idea is that since the collapse of since the end of socialism as a system, both almost everywhere in Soviet-style socialism, the kind of state feminism that sustained even the UN has weakened. Instead, we have neoliberal, neoliberal feminism that is highly concentrated on individuality, individualism, and the fight that is positioned outside of the power, because it sort of began with it started from the belief that there is free will, that feminism is something that can be achieved by fighting the whole outside of the systems of power. It's a very sort of interesting and contradictory kind of feminism. On the one hand, it believes in free will. On the other hand, it likes to kind of grab into women's issues and be outside of the mainstream kind of concerns, etc. And it has to do also with the fact that, it's originated it has developed, not originated, very much in during the second part of the 20th century, where during American during the height of American economic development, and the American housewives, middle class white housewives, were unhappy in the house, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different kind of feminism. And for Eastern European, Eastern Central European women, for women who have participated in revolutions and in wars, and have, became just as equally educated as other, as men. The kind of feminism that, was developed in the United States was just not, didn't make much sense. Right. So, but then the Western feminists don't, accept the socialist feminist as a real feminism. So there is a lot of misunderstanding from the Western part about the Eastern part. But if you read the book, and I also agree with Kristen Gutzi that the achievements of the women in socialist countries, because of transnational network, particularly because they exchanged so much information and devised together in solidarity the kinds of documents for their individual countries, for their parties, and used the language of the state, the right language, the official language, to which the parties would respond. They were quite successful. The issue now today is that the women's advancement in the country is not a criteria for many other things that was during socialism. During socialism, in order, you probably know this, a lot of people know, in order to be to qualify for subsidies, for ideological, endorsements, and for friendships, the countries needed to show that they have taken care of certain aspects and have built welfare states and organized women, ensured certain degree of equality. That is taken away now. So the states are not necessarily responsible for taking care of women in order to get something. I mean, we had a little bit of that in the 2000s during Millennium Challenge account in order to receive the money. But even without that, it's just, it was, I guess it's still there a little bit in tokenistic way, but it's not enough. So I went rambling to answer your question, but my main answer is that I think the transnational solidarity was very important. The UN Decade of Women, 75, 85, all of that, and international women's conferences, the Beijing conference and the conferences before that were mainly organized by the Socialist Transnational Network, not necessarily that much by American. So that I would say that global feminism is on decline because of that.
Thank you. So the next question is by Maksuda, if you wanna. Sorry, I think you're muted there, Maksuda.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello. Hi, good morning all. And I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say hi to Morris after seeing him after a while. And
hi, Maksuda, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm so glad to see you after a while. I'm so happy. And thank you so much for all the panelists giving this very, very informative talk. Especially, I would like to say thanks to Dr. Mandhai. Your presentation is very, very helpful to me because I am doing the research on women, and I would love to meet you in person. If you are based in Ulaanbaatar, if you are there, I would really love to see you soon, because I am also interested in the women in politics. And I have taken with you, as Professor Morse was mentioning about Yuki Kunagaya. With her, we wrote a book about women of Mongolia, which I was personally went to Mongolia and took interviews to this wonderful women who are doing a wonderful job. So I agree with Manduhai's almost everything you said. And it will be a pleasure if I will have a chance to be with you in person, talk and discuss. That's all. Thank you so much. And Professor Morris, please give my love to Mari. Thank you. Thank you all.
I
Thank you
certainly
for the
shall. I hope your daughter is doing well.
Yeah, Ruby
Is
is
she in the
doing well.
States or?
She's back in Japan, and I'll tell her.
Oh, she's
that
back in Japan.
Yes, she's here, and I'll tell her
Okay.
about you, and she will be happy. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you for the information.
Thank you.
Wonderful information. Thanks.
Thank you for getting in touch.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions? Raising your hand. Yes, bottom bottom. You can unmute yourself and ask the question, Fatima.
Hey everyone, thank you for organizing all this, and it's very interesting. And I'm sorry I don't have my video on, but I just have a quick question for Dr. Mandoha. So when I was a kid, I grew up watching all Mongolian movies, and one of it is İlk Dil, or a Dell little too big for her. So it's a movie about this lady who does everything. She's a herder, and the husband is the one who drinks and even cheats around. And then at the end, they were like expecting, oh, he's going to be the champion herder because he's the household head. And then she prepared the beautiful Dell, and at the end, she was the one who was rewarded, and she was the one who wears the Dell that's so hard to fill in. It's like the shoe that hard to fill in. So I think the arts in the movies, I think the movie is from 1960s. So do you see any, like, did you check if there's any art in movies or novels that represents the woman right and how forward-thinking the women are from Mongolia, even in the deep of socialism? So I was just going to ask that from Dr. Mandoha. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I will give you the titles of the movies. Tөвдөнгийн бор, талын цуурай, энэ хүүхнүүдүү, манай аялгау, сэрэлт. So these are the movies, and I forgot if the novel Ich Хувь Заяа is made into a movie. I don't remember, but that's Otval's novel. Цаг төрийн үмэ. Television shows include Газар Шороо, The Land, and Тонголог Тамир. All of these movies celebrate women and women's achievements.
Thank you. It's good to
You're
know.
welcome.
It's being part of the research then.
I wanted to, Dilgil Jargal, yes, I remember you from Nomadic Expeditions, indeed. Congratulations on your PhD.
Thank you.
I am in New York City, so do get in touch. I'd love to meet you for lunch or something.
All right, I'll send you an email.
Good to hear from you.
It's good to see you too.
Great.
Wonderful. Yeah, I just remember, I think Moulin was on the Facebook group discussion, Mongolian Studies, about Tongolog Tamir. I think it was on the critique of one of the books by UCB department professor. And yeah, Tongolog Tamir, it also, I think, tying back to what Simon was saying about Soviet hero, there's like very nuanced different characters, right? What did you are there I wonder if there's like a pattern of archetypes of Soviet heroes in Latadam's work as well, like not just in Altai or Manasogolskhan, but also in Tongluk Temel.
That would be very interesting. Maybe you could do that. Not so. No, well, you see, this is my way of saying I haven't actually read Tongluk Tamir. I've only seen the movie. So I don't know, but I think that would be a really, really interesting idea. And yeah, I mean, I think that his work is really interesting because I think it seems to me that he tries to in these two stories, Alted and Minister Gulden, he's really trying to create some kind of real connection between, or express some real connection between Mongolians and the Soviet. And maybe that's a really important theme that can be looked at on a really personal, domestic level in these early post-war texts.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Sorry, I only read I'm only halfway into Tongluk Temel, and I haven't read Altai, even though
it's a long novel.
Yes, it is. It's like, I don't know, 900 pages, I think. Yeah, 3 books compiled, appended. Do we have any other questions? I also, oh, okay. A. Wheeler has a question.
Yeah, hey, it's Alan. Thank you guys very much for your talks, all of them very fascinating. I had a question, and maybe there's, this is sort of so far off the actual topic, but I felt it was somewhat connected in many ways, cursory to each talk. But the idea of the of Russia as the older brother and its connection to actually the state. Of course, in the Secret History of the Mongols, you've got oh gosh, who was saying, you know, look at these people down there, they have no leader. He said, and he's given the riddle, what is it, Del Zachta Huntergute, or you know, the Del has a collar, and of the body, or the body has a head. And then in the modern Mongolian, it's what is it, Del Zachta Hunachta. So the Del has a collar, and a person has a big brother. So the Ach, in this sense, referring to Russia as the big brother, is also almost a kind of metaphor for the limits of the Del, the limits of the body being the head, and the limits of the state for Mongolia being the elder brother, that is the male brother. And so the hero, to describe the Russian, Russia as kind of, sorry, the Soviet Union as being a kind of hero, that kind of big brother motif fits in there. And I'm sure other people have written about it, I just don't remember where I read it, but, and also whether or not, and for Mandochai, I guess, is there any kind of Igich? I mean, what does Mongolian literature, or did Mongolian women actually speak about Soviet women as the Igichner or whatever? You know what I'm saying? So does that also apply to kind of sorority or sisterly solidarity, but with the Russian sisters being elder and therefore Mongolian women being more limited? It could be Simon or Mandochai and maybe more. So actually, has anybody actually been writing about the limits of the state and Soviets, sort of the Soviet big brother idea as a limiting power politically? I just don't. who has been writing that? I don't know. I'm at a teaching institution, so I have no time to read or write. So.
Mordechai, do you have anything to add? Or Morris?
I want to speak, but I think somebody should go first because I most likely take it into a darker side,
Morris? I would actually, Alan, just say, just reiterate what I was saying about the doctor in Manasa Gulin Khan. Her character is really interesting. She's very strong and very sweet and very scientific. And she's obviously ideologically pure. And I just think it's very interesting. I mean, you know, it's not a tremendously, fantastically sensitive, rounded female character, but it's a very interesting at this time. And I think she is the closest that you could possibly get to an Ikch character in this period. I have a feeling in the back of my mind, there are a couple of also more recent Ikch characters that I can't remember who they are or what stories they're in. But I think this is possibly one of the earlier ones. There is a really interesting, actually, Ikch character in Goloksen Huchen by Dandensuren, 1929. And that is when, I can't remember the names of any of these characters. I think I'm going senile. I remember, however, that towards the end of the story, the main character, the rejected girl, comes to she meets a woman who tells her to go to a UB and get educated. And this character, Mordechai is nodding. Do you remember this character's name? You don't remember, right? I don't remember either. But she meets this kind of Ikch character, and she tells the Goloksen whose name I also forget. She tells her, you know, if you go to UB, you can get educated. In the city, there is this new way of thinking. And now that you're asking this question, this is a really striking example of this, 1929, right? I can't think of anything earlier, and not very much around that period. Not really. And then you have the doctor. And I'm sure in other stories around this time, you're getting similar texts. And then these later stories, again, whose characters I forget. But yeah, I mean, I think there are examples. But you know, one of Dandensuren's reasons for writing was because there was a big push at that time in the late 20s for women. As far as I understand, Mordechai, this is correct. There was a big push about women and about education, well, definitely about education. And so I guess he just put the two together and made this story, in which the rejected girl's mother allows the rejected girl to go off, and she goes off and finds this other woman whose name I forget, and this other woman tells her to go to UB. So a whole series of powerful women in this story. This is interesting, yeah, because he was what, 20, he wrote it actually in 28. So he was 21 years old. Yeah. I had no idea when I was 21. So, I mean, this is very striking, right? Really striking what he was doing in 29 about women and about women's education. And so this final character, I'll go back to what I was saying. This final character is an early Ikch character for you. Now, Mandakha, your darkness.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating, and I can't wait to read your book, because your argument for the new book is that the intellectuals were responsible for filling that gap between the rhetoric, the ideology that the state was imposing on the people, right? So I'm just curious to know what's in there, because recently I have been reading memoirs by journalists, especially by the more repressed kind of people, who have taken me into the direction of thinking. I mean, I went to the Russian school, right? My primary sort of education was in Russian, and I grew up in the 70s, 80s. So so while I was growing up, because I was in the family of the journalists, there was an incident when a journalist has written about this tragic incidents when the Soviet military truck hit the civilian bus, and people, and the person one of the persons in the bus was helping to get the injured passengers out during and after he did, he died. So the journalist wrote about this, and Galsang, Jamin Galsang, no, Galsangin Jamin, sorry, and he was persecuted. Right, so because the truck was the Soviet, and it went on and on. It was a saga. So I would take it's interesting because it brings up a host of issues about the literary hero versus the oppression in real life, right? And the ways in which how colonial or semi-colonial sort of strategies work under the radar of friendships and supervision, and how those two things go hand in hand very delicately. And the point of and this is like decolonial theories from Latin America, from Africa, and from other places, is that a lot of the the sort of colonialism oftentimes is successful because not because of the high administration, but because of the ordinary people who are put into the everyday lives, where they live as teachers, as cafeteria workers, as, you know, someone teaching to play guitar and things like that. How these agents themselves are not aware that they are carriers of certain kinds of enculturation. So why I was saying that the hero of so one way in which these theories argue, and part of it is applicable in Mongolian case, especially in regards to older brother and sort of more obvious older brother and less obvious older sister, unless we bring up there is more, and I think there is research needed, is the fact that certain kind of masculinity is very much preferred for certain political sort of conditions, right? And sort of fashioning men in hierarchical order and instituting certain forms of bodily behavior and ways of thinking and things like that is more rigorously monitored, and hence the figure of the older brother, and hence the celebration of heroes and things like that goes on as a fashioning of a particular kind of personhood, whereas women are empowered. So a lot of it goes like that, the more powerful sort of people come to liberate the women and subdue or refashion, civilize the men, right? So maybe particularly because of that, there is this more of an elder brother who is more prominent, or maybe because of the figure of the Soviet is also much more in industry, in more masculine sort of terms, in industry, in military, in politics, and things like that. But the everyday teachers and cooks and other people were there too, but it's just hadn't materialized in each figure as much, it seems. And women in Mongolia have been sort of empowered for all kinds of reasons, whereas according to the memoirs that people now write after socialism, and these are probably sometimes maybe even people who wrote very positively about the 80s and 70s, now write sort of kind of the other sides, the memoirs, not official stuff, in a different kind of ways. So.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I remember reading Dr. Wasabi's Modern Mongolia a few years ago, and it was very interesting how the reform basically was evaluated by different international experts, and how we don't know about that angle. So that was very illuminating. So I guess my question is, your book has recently been, I think in one last year or 2 years ago, your book was recently translated into Mongolian, and I think it caused quite a discussion. Have you ever heard of your readers responding to your book's Mongolian translation? Have they reached out to you? How has the responses been so far? And I apologize if my voice, if my signal is spotty.
I tell you, my internet connection is terrible, and I could not get your question or comment entirely at all. Rolled into one. So sorry, if you could write it up, I can respond to you. But
oh, sure.
I just couldn't hear a thing. The internet connection is terrible. Sorry.
Morris, I think the question, I didn't hear all of it, but the question I think was about, were you able to respond or have a discussion with readers, Mongolian readers who read translation of your book?
Have I had discussions with them, do you mean?
Mm-hmm. Or did you have chance to respond or think, or do you want to say something? Is that correct, Natsu? Was that the question?
Yeah, like how have the responses been? I'm just wondering if it was.
I've had. Okay, I got your question. Have I had a lot of responses? I've had some responses by some of the American officials who were here at the time, pushing certain philosophies, and they anonymously book on Amazon, and they were not very pleasant responses, because I was critical of some of the philosophy, some of the economic philosophy that was being not imposed, but at least suggested to Mongolian government officials. That kind of response I did. I haven't had much Mongolian responses directly to me, but I've seen some Mongolian commentary. People are both negative and positive. It's controversial. I dealt with controversial issues, and I think in some ways I've been right about what happened in Mongolia from 2005 on. In some days I was wrong, but present a view that was as accurate as possible at that time period. I was very critical of some of the Western advice that was given to Mongols, and some of the IMF people, and the Asian Development Bank people, and some have changed their views. The IMF changed its on an international level, changed some of its views about economic development. That's all I can say. Mandukhai, did you have a comment or?
Yeah, I mean, I had a quick comment to you, but also I had a piece of answer to the very first question. Is that okay if I jump in, because we are like almost done?
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, your book was very helpful, I think, to the people who have seen, who thought about transition as something that can be done mechanically. And for economic advisors, especially who went to grad school in the US and learned to think in neoliberal economic terms in Chicago school sort of terms without really seeing any other sort of ways of doing things. So that was, I'm hoping that that's, that I'm glad to hear that they have changed their views, at least some of them. So a quick piece of answer to the very first question about the women's movement, women's organization. So women's organization during socialism was demoted multiple times. And that was one of the most important part of the conversation that I wanted to bring up, because people don't know much about it, that the high status, by the time it gained its sort of position in the, next to the government place, actually inside the Parliament House. That was back in what, 70s, 80s during Miss Otwald's time. But before that, it kept getting demoted multiple times. And the idea is that the women had to, because it was part of the state, they had to learn to speak the language of the state and become integrated into the ways in which how the state worked. That is not possible today if this is an independent organization, but it's something to think about, what language to think, where to find support. And the most important thing I think the women's organizations can do these days in order to move forward with various policies and things like that is to really push the women in the parliament. And that's why having more women in legislature and in higher offices is important, so that the women's organizations can keep them accountable. They are mostly not necessarily feminist, and they don't have to be, because the women politicians' primary loyalty is to the party, to their party, and then to feminism or any kind of women's organization. So it's the work of the women's organizations to hold them accountable. It's just practice. It's not a doctrine or any kind of known theory, but this has been the experience. That has been the way to work. So anyways.
Thank you, Dr. Mandukhai. Yeah, actually, I remember from your book, Tragic Spirits, you mentioned that the female shamanists were also getting even more obscured or shrouded among the community. So that's also a very interesting phenomenon from the period, socialist period. Okay. Oh, actually, so
thank you for reading Tragic Spirit.
Oh, sure. It was a great book. Yeah, we by the way, we have to put a little plug. at the ACMS library. We know we're in a lockdown due to Corona, but we have all three of the speakers' books. And I would like to ask all the speakers to talk about their, maybe if our participants wants to read more, I think at least Simon and Manduha have books coming out, to the best of my knowledge. So if you guys would like to talk, where they can read the book, when they're coming out, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the support. Scholarly writing is so tough. You write it for many years and then it's just there, like two people buy it, yourself and your mom.
Well, we buy it. ACMS also.
No, it was a joke. Thank you. It was a joke, but it's not like, New York Times bestseller. It's not like a novel, or, So, anyways, but of course we are very appreciative that you guys are doing the work you're doing.
Natsa, did you want us to say something about these books?
Yeah, when are your books coming out? And Dr. Wasabi also, where can we buy your latest book? Maybe we can with that.
Okay. Simon, why don't you go first, and I'll wind up.
Okay. Oh, now I have to remember the books. So there's one that's just been published this month that Philip Masloff from Kansas State University and myself edited. Morris is in this. Actually, Morris Mary's paper about Simukov is in this book, and it's called, Morris, do you remember what it's called? Socialist and Post-Socialist Mongolia. It's from Routledge. And then in June, there's a book of translations, stories, being published by Columbia University Press. And that's my translation, and it's called Sun Cranes and Other Stories. And it's got about, 20, 25 short stories since 1920, 27, 28, something like that. So yes, please buy them all. Please buy all of these books. Morris?
I just put out a book, a History of China, which just came out on March 19th, put out by Wiley and Blackwell, which is more like a text, a book on the Uyghurs, China and the Uyghurs will be coming out in November, and an edited book put out by Bonn University Press on Ming tributary relations will be coming out, I guess, in July. Those are three coming out within the year. And the Cambridge History of the Mongol Empire is going to come out. I've got several chapters in there. So that's what I've been working on.
You guys are so prolific. I'm just finished like my second book on After Tragic Spirit is coming next year. So it's titled 1,000 Steps to Parliament, Women running for elections in Mongolia. So it's coming with the University of Chicago Press next year. And then there are other things, but I'm not ready to talk. Not coming as soon as I wanted them to be. So elections are difficult because they only happen, the parliamentary elections only happen once in 4 years. So I had to kind of wait. I was worried that I might make a mistake because I can't anonymize my interlocutors. So I can't make any mistakes. So I keep sending back different things to different people to check and make sure that everything is correct and things like that. So it took longer than I expected. Of course, this is not an excuse, but still, it's never study elections. If you study elections, only study one, and then just let it go. Otherwise, you have to wait and like you worry about, oh, let's look at this election, and then before you finish, the next election happens. So like, oh, I have to now include this one. So never do that.
Great. Oh, thank you. Yes. So, and also, like we have, our library has Simon's earlier translations, like Step Stories and everything. We haven't been able to procure the Sun Cranes because of the COVID and everything, but looking
No, that
forward
hasn't
to.
come out yet. But that hasn't
Oh yeah,
come out
yeah,
yet.
of course. Yeah, sorry.
That comes in June.
Oh right, yeah, yeah. I forgot. But yeah, we look forward to acquiring your books and sharing with our members. And I'm just seeing a comment by Bozlan. If you want to, Bozlan, if you want to voice that out, you can do that. Otherwise, we're ready to wrap up. Bozlan, would you like to? Would you like me to read it? I can also read.
Yeah, could you please read it?
Okay, sure. So she's responding to Alan Wheeler's question about the Big Brother idea. She says, I'm not very sure, but I just have this feeling that the root of the idea came from Russia itself. Students from Mongolia who went to study in Russia might have adopted this idea from Russian Soviet state discourse on brother nations and minorities. As I remember that Mongolian students studied in Russia, who studied in Russia learned to use a diminutive and racist term, Baghut, or minorities. So thank you for that. That's a great insight as well. So with that, let's thank all our panelists and also thank all our participants who made the time to tune in, and see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Natso. Thank you.
Thank you.